Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network. Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over. Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. This is our weekly 2 cent segment. I'm Pete Wargent and I'm joined by Chris Bates. G'day, Chris. How's your week been?
Pete, good to be back. Had a week off from the chair with the chat with you. So had a good time in Fiji for a couple of weeks. Came back refreshed and ready to get stuck back into it. How have you been? How's things in the UK still?
Well, we had Superstar Owen on the podcast last week, and we were very envious of your week off in Fiji. Did you get much in the way of sunshine?
We got a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. 6 days of sun, 6 days of rain. It's two unseasonal, decent storms, actually, that stuck around for a while. So, on the last Friday, actually, we got some good news. We ended up winning Australian Residential Broker of the Year. So it's a national award. All the brokers can go into it, and we ended up winning that in Broker of the Year, the whole thing. So, the team went to that, and we were super happy. So that was a nice little thing to celebrate on the final day of being in Fiji. So what else has been happening with you, Peter? You the team been buying a bit? I know, mutually a client actually bought this week. So what else has been happening? We have,
yes. I saw the award for your broking business. So congrats on that. It was a really good snare, actually. A big scalp for you guys. So and richly deserved. We've been pretty busy. We've got a commercial property search underway in Southeast Queensland, a couple of purchases in Brisbane, and actually we're getting a bit of inquiry through now. I think with all of the news flows over the past few weeks, things like wages growth and unemployment and inflation, I think a lot of people have just said, right, we're pretty close to the top for interest rates, and if I'm going to buy, I'm just going to get on with it. So, that's all happening. Also, don't forget, I think I say this every week, but if you haven't got your tickets for the Rask Roadshow, that's well underway now, and I'm speaking at a few of those events over the next few weeks. I guess it's the next 4 or 5 weeks, actually, it goes on for. So definitely check out the Rask Roadshow, because the tickets are pretty cheap. There's food and drink involved as well. So you can't argue with the value. So that's about it, my end, Chris. So,
I think on your IR end as well, you said that things are getting a bit busier. We've seen a gradual increase of buyers wanting to enter. The real opportunistic sort of first home buyer / investor was like late last year, and more the must-do upgrader, or the first home buyer that's maybe been sitting around in their hands for a long time. Is sort of like, maybe now's a good time to buy. So there's just different buyer pools have sort of been entering, and we've just seen our pre-approval lists get longer and longer and longer, and buyers are adjusting where they're searching because borrowing capacity is down. And just I think the May-June rate increases, for that period, I do think that was a little bit of a slowdown in buyer attitude to buy. They were getting a bit nervous. A lot of the talk was RBA rate was going to go closer to 5. But since, the RBA's paused the last couple of months, and, you're right, the story is now shifting to maybe we're at the top of the cycle, and even, CBA coming out with rate cuts next year. And, that sort of, I think buyers are definitely like, let's get on with it. But, it's the middle of August right now. We have seen listings increase in areas generally where clients don't want to buy, in investor hotspots. But it's going to be interesting to see, because listings really should start to shift up now. All the agents are back from their European holidays, and, the kids' school holidays are all done, and it's, it should be starting to be a real increase in listings. And it's going to be interesting to watch what happens over the next 2.5 months. Because I think the buyers are there. The buyers are there. They're patient. They want to buy, but just the listings are holding them back. So that would be where I think we're at. It's going to be a big couple of months ahead.
There were some stats out only this week about the arrivals and departures. 1.75 million arrivals in July, a massive shoot up. And that's an estimated figure, but that's basically, as you said, that's people coming back from Italy, but also international students arriving for the next semester. And that was way ahead of the number of departures at 1.5 million. So that on the net basis, that's 250,000 people extra in the country. So not surprising then you're going to see an uptick in people looking to buy, probably more people into the rental market. So yeah, busy time of year ahead. And well, let's kick on to our big three news stories of the week. So look, every Sunday morning at 7 a.m, you'll find our 2 Cents podcast episode waiting for you in your podcast player. And what we basically do is we answer your questions and we cover the big three news stories of the week. So this week, Housing Industry Association put out a media release on lot prices across all of Australia's capital cities over the past decade. So we saw a change in prices and also a change in the average size of a land release. So a bit of an interesting data series for us to go through there, Chris. Secondly, the mortgage cliff, that fixed rate mortgage cliff, we're now about halfway through. So we take a quick look at what's happening in terms of things like arrears, what's it doing to household cash flows, and what does it mean for the housing market. And thirdly, and finally, the Labor government has announced a new housing supply target. So previously in the budget, they came out with this figure of 1 million well-located homes over 5 years. Well, at the stroke of a pen, it's now 1.2 million over the 5 years to July 2029 instead of 1 million. So we'll take a look at what that actually means in practice, because media release is one thing, but the practical reality might be something a bit different. So, Chris, let's kick off with this HIA media release. So land prices up significantly over the past decade, according to the Housing Industry Association, especially the very large increases in Sydney and Hobart. Perth, not so much. I guess if you look at the timing, 2013 to 2023, well, that was the peak of the mining boom through to today. So the median lot price in Perth has gone from about 320k to, well, just a little bit higher, really. It has barely moved. But in Sydney, a whole different kettle of fish, from 285,000 to 664,000. So an increase of about 140%. I think, Chris, when I was going through these numbers, the thing that struck me is that the lot size over the past decade is really shrunk. So Sydney from 510 square metres down to 375, but actually everywhere except for Adelaide, the lot sizes were way down. So actually, if you look at lot prices per square metre, well, in Sydney, they're up over 200%, Melbourne 122%, Hobart 162%. I guess, well, this is to some degree not that much of a surprise, but I guess this is where people get the results in property in a country like Australia, because population growth has been huge, projected population growth of 2.2 million over the next 5 years, and that seems to be on the low side. And there's just not that much well-located land to be released. The stuff, well, the blocks are getting smaller and further away from the city.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the lot size getting smaller is part of the issue. When prices go up, buyers can't afford to keep stretching for, the prices to keep going up, right? So the only way the developer can sell them is kind of reduce the lot sizes, which doesn't mean the price has to rise as much. And I mean, it's a little bit like buying a Cadbury chocolate bar, right? I think, it used to be 200 grams, now it's 180. It used to be 55 grams, now it's like 39 grams. Like, instead of putting the prices up, just reduce the size of the product. And I think it's a bit worrying, to be honest, because how far further can they reduce the size of the lots? Will we go down from 390 down to 300? Where we almost have like semi-size or inner city size blocks in the greenfield estates on the edge of the city. It's just, and that also means that there's less space for trees. It's less space for, which is not great in these areas, right? You do need some tree cover to keep the heat down and things like that. So I'm a little bit worried about the overall what we're building just to get properties released to the market, I guess. But I mean, there is a huge increase in land, and land goes up. There'd also be a bit of an increase in the build costs, right? So building prices have gone up. So especially in recent years, and hence why, the newer builds are much more expensive than the older ones. But are you getting a better product, like a 390 square meter block versus a 500 square meter block? And I think you just always got to remember, if you've got an older block that's 6, 7, 800, 900 square meters, and they're building 400 square meter blocks or 500 or 600 square, or even 500 square meter blocks in the past, are you really competing, right? So all this new supply is not affecting your asset because you've got a much superior product. You know, a 600 square meter block in an established community with bigger roads and more tree cover and less density. I would say that that's more desirable than 400 square meter blocks with very little land left in the middle.
I think this is one of the things when you're trying to measure something like inflation. It's actually, when you start digging into it, it's way more complicated than people would tend to think. You see a number reported, inflation is 5% or 6%. And on face value, that's quite simple. But then when you actually dig into it, you might have, let's think, electronic goods have effectively got much cheaper over the years. But then other things like healthcare costs or education have shot up, and housing, of course, being one of those components. And then when you dig into it, well, consumer preferences change. So the basket of goods in the inflation measurements changes over time. And as you touched on there, actually, one of the things that does go on is what they call shrinkflation. So you might be paying the same amount of money, but you're not getting as much for it sometimes. So I think when you actually dig into the inflation measurements, it's very, very complex. Once you dig into the chain measures and the different products that go into the basket. So as it relates to housing, yeah, for sure, the lot sizes have got smaller. The types of properties generally, I suppose, over time have improved in terms of the quality. If you went back a long time ago, housing stock in Australia was pretty poor quality, to be honest. And I think, well, this is something we'll come on to, I guess, in our third story, Chris, is that if you try to build a lot of housing quickly, there's going to be problems. And we saw that in the apartment construction boom, 2016, 2017. But yeah, construction costs, as measured by the ABS in their producer price figures, up 33%, the housing construction inputs over 3 years. So that's a massive increase. And yes, construction costs generally have trended higher over the past 50 years pretty consistently, but we've never seen anything like this, 33% increase. And I guess that's largely a story of COVID, lack of supply, massive demand from home builder, big population growth rebound, and all of these things just feeding that pressure on land prices.
Yeah, and I just wonder whether they're sustainable, these house and land packages at these prices, because this is probably looking at the height of the boom, these prices. 2013 was very early in the last Sydney boom, right? And so it hadn't really done much in, 8 to 10 years before that, Sydney. And so I think, they're probably underpriced, and they've had a huge run up in the last decade with 2 booms, to be honest. And are they going to be sustainable, this type of growth, or when borrowing capacity is so tight? Can these, when, a couple that wants to buy in this house and land package, it's usually a first home buyer, incomes are quite tight because they're still in their early years of their career, and they can only borrow 4 or 4.5 times their income, not a 6 or 7 they could have borrowed, when these figures were probably figured out. And so, the thing that's going to drive their prices up in the future is borrowing capacity going back up. But, that's going to come after rate increases, rate reductions. So, I do wonder if this type of growth is sustainable, or they have to keep shrinking to keep selling them. So, we'll move on to the next story, Pete.
Well, in one sense, not sustainable, because the HIA figures did show that sales have actually been going down quite consistently over recent months and recent quarters. So maybe there is a constraint there on borrowing, which is just not allowing people to get in. But anyone who's tried to buy a vacant block of land to build on in Australia would know how hard that can be. For some people, it involves camping out overnight, queuing, desperately trying to get in, and you very rarely see good blocks of land come up for sale on the domain or real estate portals. And when they do, the people pour all over them at very high prices. So it's a tough dynamic out there. So yes, Chris, let's kick on with the second story. The mortgage cliff. Fin Review put out an article saying the mortgage cliff, is it a mirage? So we've got around about $350 billion of fixed rate mortgages resetting this year. And in a lot of cases, people are resetting from fixed rates of around 2% on their mortgage to something maybe around, say, 6%, I guess would be normal. You'd know better than me, Chris.
Yeah.
So we've got a couple of $1 trillion of mortgage debt in Australia. 350 billion is a big chunk of change, but I guess we're about halfway through that reset now. Commonwealth Bank reported their results to the ASX recently, and yes, mortgage arrears have gone up a little bit, but 90-day arrears are still only 0.43%, 30-day arrears 0.92%. So so far that's pretty benign. Bendigo Bank as well, so there's hardly any increase really in arrears there. I think what we're definitely seeing, Chris, is people tightening their belts. So we're starting to see retail sales figures falling. I guess we're seeing a lot less confidence in the labour force now. So unemployment's rising. So I think the biggest driver of mortgage arrears and mortgage defaults is really whether people have a job or not, and not necessarily just the mortgage rate that they're paying.
Yeah, and I think what was interesting I read about the CBA reports as well is that the spending absolutely is getting cut back by, the 30s and 40-year-olds with the mortgages. But, the baby boomers who are, are getting close to retirement or retired, the 20-year-olds that are, haven't got big mortgages, that have got their jobs, are still out there spending, right? And so it's really that highlighted the spending cutbacks getting really the brunt is getting done by the people with mortgages, right? And anecdotally, with all our clients, we can see there's some huge concern there. Absolutely, lots of our clients are rolling off their fixed rates. You're right, circa 6%, even higher for investment properties. Bank pricing has actually come back. So the competition was at its peak, probably May time, I would say. And that's when the optimal pricing was in the market. So the banks are reducing their discounts. So if you locked in yourself a better deal in May, which we did for our clients, we actually went and repriced every single one of our clients in the last 6 months. We can't reprice them as a good rate. The rates they were offering back then were actually better than new rates today. So, I do think that clients are all people are across this. You can see this through arrears rates, and I think CBA, they released a big profit. Nothing unusual there, $10 billion. But they do have that, incentive now that if there is some issues, that they could potentially take some losses and to help, borrowers stay in their homes. I actually had a chat with a guy in Fiji. Didn't do too much work chat, but couldn't resist when I found out he worked for one of the mortgage insurers, and it was quite high up, and we had a really good chat around what they're seeing, right? So they're getting frontline. These are people who've got taken out LMI, and so it's 80% plus loans, but a lot at 90 or 95%. And I guess the money they've set aside for losses has been way over conservative, and they basically thought there'd be all these delinquencies that have to forgo all this money and pay back the banks, and that hasn't eventuated, and they were kind of shocked. And it's obviously good news for them, but it's also interesting. He was saying, as an insurer, they're meant to be paying money out, but they're not paying money out. So there's a lot of pressure on them to reduce the cost, because if you're not paying out, well, what are you doing with the money, right? You should be able to. And so I do think this isn't happening. This whole sort of fixed rate cliff that was going to be all these people rushing for the exits. I think also a lot of our clients are a bit optimistic that there's only this limited time frame they have to really knuckle down for, and that we're at the peak of the cycle in terms of rates, and that rate cuts maybe 1 or 2 years away, and it's not going to this doomsday where they're going to 7%. And so people have that motivation. If you can just get on top of it now, you can make your cutbacks, you can stay in your home, you're not forced to sell. You work on your income and you just ride this wave out. It's not like there's another big wave's going to come and hit you because rates are going to go even higher. So I think that's where a lot of borrowers feel right now, is that the pain's going to be worth it.
People can see the sheer weight of population growth, and it's not a dynamic where people think they want to be out of the market for too long. I think to your point, Chris, on the fixed rate cliff and the doomsday scenario, I think this has been in the news now for so long. People have been talking about it for a year, and it's one of those known risks, a bit like the interest only cliff some years back when we had about 40% of loans by value on interest only. Rules were changed and that dropped all the way down to nearer 10%, but the world kept turning. And I think this is something similar. We've been talking about the fixed rate cliff for so long that, yes, we're starting to see things like cutbacks in discretionary retail clothing, footwear, cosmetics, definitely some downturn there. But historically, anyway, mortgage rates at the moment are still very, very low. So, of course, they will go up. They practically would have to because they've been so low. I guess the one thing which is showing no sign of changing is APRA's 3% mortgage buffer, which banks need to add on to market rates when they're assessing new customer loans. I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to see banks stress testing at 10% when interest rates are expected to fall at some point. But I guess that's a policy which is probably going to be held in place throughout this year, perhaps to some level anyway, to try and bring down inflation, to not allow exuberance to come back in any way, shape or form. But obviously, Chris, that would have an impact on how much people can borrow.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I do think, there's only been 2 rate pauses. And, if that goes on for 3 to 6 months and then there is some rate cuts, then I think that's when APRA has got the right to jump on in. I think this leads into our third story, to be honest, which I won't steal your thunder, but ultimately one thing that's going to hold us back building a lot of houses is buyers. Even though you want to buy and you want to get out of rental accommodation, or you do want to buy your first place, when they go to a broker and they realize what they can borrow, maybe they can't borrow enough to go and buy. And so I think this is building $1.2 million homes, let's go into the third story, Pete, because I'm stealing your thunder.
Well, no, my thunder, I guess this was, while you were sunning yourself over on the beach in Fiji, or dodging the rain anyway, and drinking some pina coladas. There was a lot of stuff being talked about. There was debates about rent freezes, changes to tenancy rights, and there was legislation drafted to freeze rates. All sorts of stuff has been going on. Anyway, we've had an announcement. The government has increased its target to 1.2 million homes over the 5 years to 2029. So effectively kicking off in July 2024. Now, I guess if you're not familiar, the Labour government previously announced that they would look to build 1 million well-located homes over 5 years, without a whole lot of discussion about how that was going to happen. But actually, I guess if you're not sort of following this story closely, this is not about the government actually building housing. What they're really talking about here is encouraging state governments to cut the red tape, get out of the way, allow land release, more building. And the ALP has announced anyway $3.5 billion to be invested to help housing supply, which will be done via a $15,000 grant towards developers who are delivering dwellings. But again, you see these numbers, I'm going to count it, and you can't kid a kidder. $3.5 billion sounds like a bit of money, but this is a 5-year policy. So that's $700 million a year, which really is a pittance when you're talking about increasing housing supply. And, we know what's happening to the value of money over time. So I guess that's one thing. Now we've got record high immigration, but Chris, the first thing that springs to mind is firstly quality versus quantity, but also we're really struggling at the moment. There's builders and developers going into insolvency or receivership left, right and centre. Materials prices have been very high. We've got a shortage of labour. We're really struggling to deliver as things stand. And from memory, the highest figure we've ever achieved, even in the biggest of the apartment construction boom period 5 or 6 years ago, was about 225,000 dwelling completions or so. Now we're proposing 240,000 a year for 5 years. I mean, it seems like a huge ask to me. And don't forget, last time around, we had all kinds of issues with defects and leaks and structural issues and issues with balconies and all sorts of stuff, flammable cladding. So in that great rush to build housing, there was a lot sort of overlooked, and we got a lot of very poor quality stock, some of which didn't even survive. So what was your takeaway, Chris?
Look, it's a bit of a catch-22. I do think that we need to be building more, but the reality is, can we build more when the government's doing lots of, infrastructure spending? There's a lot happening at that level that's taking a lot of the labour away from the residential space. A lot of people building industrial, commercial, etc. So I think the reality of actually building it, have we got the workers for it? I think there's a demand problem. I do think that first home buyers and investors who ultimately should be buying these things, because it is going to be done by the private sector. It's not like the company's going to be buying this or super funds. Build to rent's going to be lucky to be 5 or 10% of that number, right? It's not going to be, 80 or 90%. So I think there's a buyer problem. So I think this, reality is they would have to have some type of the 5% deposit scheme. You'd have to have that around. You'd have to have increases in borrowing capacity. You'd probably have to be waiving the stamp duty. So I think they have to be doing more for the buyers as well to actually allow them to buy all these things. I do think there's a bit of a positive here. I mean, ultimately, I think this, national government and the state governments, a bit of pressure on them to actually deliver on their targets. I think that's starting to flow through. I mean, Peter Short came on the podcast. He was there is a bit of, well located is starting to enter this. So yes, not on the fringes, not high rises, but actually where people want to live. And, I was looking at I came back from Fiji. I looked at urban development. I sort of quickly read all those articles just to, because it's always interesting to know what's getting approved and what's getting built. And, there's a development in Crow's Nest. I didn't read in a lot of detail, but basically the height limit was much higher than what was been approved there in the past. And I think that's a sign of things to get changed. I think a state government overruled the local government. And I think that's going to happen more and more where, a good development that's probably going to increase housing supply is probably going to start to get more approved than it was in the past. And I think that's probably means the NIMBYs have got something to worry about here, I guess. So it is a bit of a catch-22. Now, I think if it's a stretch target and you get 80% of the way there, well, that's $1 million. And that's probably what we're going to get to anyway. But I do think this pressure on supply is a good thing rather than just focusing on demand. Hey, we're going to do more grants. We're going to do more low deposit home loans and forgetting that we actually need to be building a lot more if we want to grow our population and just to solve the pent-up demand in the housing market, the people in apartments who want houses, the first-time buyers who want to enter, the renters who, can't find anywhere to rent. So it's a big problem. There's actually some articles to say that, this could be going on for decades. And the reality is it probably will. So this won't just solve it in 5 years, even if we built 1.2, knowing how much we're growing our population and the demand there.
The Prime Minister does seem to have backed away from the idea of a rent freeze or rent caps. The Reserve Bank governor also said it would probably be a bad idea, which would ultimately reduce rental supply. But there is some strengthening around tenant rights. So I guess firming up the relevant grounds for eviction. I think there'll be a push towards allowing more renters to have pets. Now, I guess there will be phasing in of these minimum rental standards and also limiting rent rises to once every 12 months. But I don't think we're going to see a national rent freeze or a national rent cap, which would potentially make the problem worse. I think there's some other bits and pieces. The shared equity scheme is continuing to be rolled out. This looks more or less like an extension of what Labour Party had already had in place. I think obviously the opposition said were critical and said they've just plucked a number from thin air. I think that there might be an element of truth in that. I think one of the problems for a political party that's been in opposition for a long time, the whole role is to be in opposition, and then they're suddenly thrust into power. And often you find for the first term, it takes a while to get results and to get real policies making a real difference. And I certainly saw this in the UK with the new Labour Party in opposition for years and years. And then for the first term, they suffered from what was called initiative-itis, lots of media release and lots of sort of priming the press and controlling the media and all this kind of stuff. But eventually people want to see actual results. And I guess this is going to be the challenge. It's easy to announce a target of 1.2 million homes over 5 years, but then actually delivering that is going to be much harder. So yes, there'll be a big push for land release. rezoning, but I seriously question or be very cautious about buying a new dwelling in that type of environment. We saw this 5 or 6 years ago with the big apartment construction boom, and there were all kinds of issues with those new builds. And if there's going to be a big rush to build as much as possible at a time when we don't have enough skilled labour, materials prices are very, very high, margins are thin, or there's a lot that could potentially go wrong. So caveat emptor, I guess.
Yeah, maybe we start to see some rezoning. It's like the talks there, then the rezoning starts to happen and developers start getting better feasibility and start to, get some DAs and start to figure out what's possible and start to get some sales. So maybe it's going to, it's not a bad thing here to start to flip it on the head and say, actually, what we need to do is start to build. And so hopefully that's, I think the state government went around and said, can you find any land that's worth the federal government, I think, said that. So, what land have we got that's underutilized and different sites around the country or, basically got found. And so I think this is a good thing. I do think that we're heading in the right direction. We are focusing on building more, but I agree, unless we keep the quality of that building up, then it's going to be pointless. In 10 years' time, we're going to start to say, we've got all these building issues again. And have we got enough great builders sticking around? And so I think that's the real issue. We're going into this when builders have not really risk on themselves. They're not just thinking money's cheap, let's just go for it. They've been burnt. Now they're a bit cautious on what projects they take on. They've got to really stack up and they're worried about getting the labor and the materials. And, does this just lead to inflation in labor prices again? Does it increase our material prices again? And, what have we done? We just made it even harder to build because prices have gone up. So, yeah, it's going to be a watch this space. But I do think it's heading in the right direction. I do, rather than focusing, hey, we've got a demand problem. People can't afford to buy. Let's just give them more money to buy.
There's not much of a debate that happens around immigration and the right number there. Now, I guess it's a little bit unfair here because we went through a period where the borders were closed. And then we saw, we had a major issue a year ago with practically every cafe you went to. Staff shortages, staff required, can't open today, haven't got enough staff. I mean, those problems are now going away. The unemployment rate rose to 3.7% this month. So that's the highest in 14 months. The underemployment rate at the highest in a year. So I guess that shortage of labour is being fixed. But yes, the very high rates of immigration are clearly a major factor in the demand for housing, and that's probably a conversation which will get more airtime over time. I think on the interest rates point, 3 of the big four banks are now forecasting that interest rates have peaked. I think it's just Alan Oster over at NAB still looking for another hike potentially. Westpac and ANZ both forecasting property price increases 2023, 2024, 25. So that's a big change from a year ago. And a lot can change very quickly at the moment, it seems, Chris. It's been a wild ride over the past 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I think the marketing for this isn't great as well. The Albanese is saying it's great news for renters. Well, a lot of renters in 5 years' time, maybe when they build it all, it's going to potentially reduce rental prices. But a lot of renters actually want to buy. That's their dream. What they want to be is great news to buy, right? And I don't know. And also, I don't know whether investors are going to fall for this. I think investors aren't as silly, not as silly. So it's probably a tough word to say, but, buying new property back in the last boom was, the building issues weren't really known. The issues with, capital growth and supply wasn't really prolific out there. I think that news is widespread now. We very rarely get clients wanting to go down the off the plan route. They've read some story. They've got the war stories of friends and family. And so I think, to get this more rental stock, you basically need to sell them to investors. And I'm just not sure investors are going to fall for the bait like Anthony Albanese hopes. And a renter's really worried about their rental prices in 5 years' time. Yes, some are, obviously, but a lot of them are actually hoping to buy. And so what you really want to do is solve their problems longer term rather than solve their short-term rental.
So, yes, exactly right. So to summarise on our big 3 news stories of the week, land prices have surged over the past decade, said the Housing Industry Association. Land cost inflation of 100% in Melbourne, 130% in Sydney, 150% in Hobart. But actually, if you account for the small size of lots in 2023 compared to a decade ago, much bigger increase in land cost per square metre. We're about halfway through the mortgage cliff, or the fixed rate cliff now, so not quite in the home stretch. We're probably in the eye of the storm at the moment, but so far at least the fallout has been relatively benign, but we'll definitely keep watching that and how it unfolds over the months ahead. And finally, the Labour Party has announced a new goal of housing supply of 1.2 million new dwellings over 5 years to July 2029. That doesn't account for things like demolitions or obsolete housing stock. So we're really going to have our work cut out, and it'll be interesting to see. At this point, it seems optimistic in the current environment in particular, but we'll definitely have to see how that plays out. And I guess, that's a couple of election cycles away, and if you under-deliver, well, people have largely forgotten by then anyway. So the skeptic in me says we've seen similar issues with the promised reduction in energy and power bills, which, let's say they haven't quite transpired so far. So, Chris, I think that's about it for today. If people want to catch up with you at Blusk or ask you any questions, where should they go?
Just jump in the show notes, people. There's a link there, and the team would absolutely love to have a chat. And you're
Fantastic.
Pete, and good news for you, Pete. When you came back, I'd be your 14 blogs there or whatever it might be in the inbox, and I read them all. So I appreciate you keep sending them through every day. So if you're not following Pete's blog, jump on there.
I'm glad you're reading, and you can always catch me on Twitter at Pete Wargent as well, or Pete Wargent Blogspot is my daily blog, my daily musing. So yeah, send us your property questions. Links in the show notes there. And if I don't catch you soon, Chris, well, I guess I'll see you around the traps. I think we're speaking at a couple of events together over the next couple of months. So I'll catch up in person as well fairly soon. I've got a week in Sydney coming right up as well. So looking forward to it.
See you soon, Pete. Cheers.
Cheers.